Hello everybody, welcome to this Copernicus Marine Service training on the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement. My name is Alexandre Morin and I will be your trainer for this exercise. So this agreement is often called the High Seas Treaty. It establishes a legal framework for the conservation of biodiversity in areas beyond any national jurisdiction. And of course, the cornerstone of this treaty is the requirements for environmental impact assessments. Because of course any planned activity in the high seas may have biological impacts, and it is important to be able to predict them. And to do that, the Copernicus Marine Service may provide useful data because the catalog provides high resolution multi-area analysis for global ocean physics and also for biological variables. So the Copernicus Marine Service data may provide useful data to calculate environment baselines, to model connectivity, and of course to assess risks and potential impacts of human activities in the high seas. So in this notebook, we'll try to assess the potential risks of diffusion of pollutants or even any objects in the high seas. So using currents field as an environmental reference, and we'll also use thermal thrones to identify critical areas of potential biological activity. And in the end of this notebook, we'll simulate the trajectory of particles, which can be referred to as pollutants, for instance, to generate probabilistic risk maps at the end of the notebook. So we'll be working with Python. In this section, I will briefly tell you about the different libraries that we're going to use in this notebook. First, we were going to use NumPy, which is one of the most common packages in Python. If you've already worked with Python, you're probably already familiar with this package, which is fundamental to work with ND arrays. We're going to use Xarray, which is the also most common Python package to work with NetCDF data, which is the format of most datasets provided by the Copernicus Marine Service. And we'll use Matplotlib and Cartopy to draw the different graphs and maps that we're going to generate in this notebook. So in this cell, we just import all the libraries that I have told you about just before that. If you are using the binder hub designed for the Copernicus Marine Service, you should have this Python 3 kernel already activated. Make sure to have it activated, and this kernel will have all those libraries already pre-installed, so you shouldn't need to install anything else. You should already be ready to import. Next, I've defined, one miscellaneous function that we're going to use repeatedly during the notebook. So we're just defining here, so we can just use it in one line in the subsequent sections of the notebook. It's just a function that draws basic geographical features on the various maps that we're going to plot in the notebook. So you can just see that it's a feature that draws coastlines, borders, add the grid lines, and just zooms in on an area of interest defined in the entry input arguments. So it's just a function that we're going to repeatedly use during this training. So it's nice to define it at the beginning of the notebook, so we don't have to think about it later. Next, I'm going to introduce you to the dataset that we are going to use in this training. We're going to use a dataset called Global Ocean Physics Reanalysis, which is provided by the Copernicus Marine Service. We can visit the dedicated page on the Copernicus Marine Service website, which is this page here. Just a few key information on the product. So it's generated using a powerful model called NEMO, which is combined with real-world data to fit actual ocean phenomenon. And it has about roughly a 8 km resolution and is available on several depth levels, namely 50 here. And in our case, we're going to use the current data that is available in the product, and also the temperature, which are listed here, but there are more variables available in the product, and we're going to use daily data from this product. So if you go to the dedicated page on the data access tab here, you can see here the different data sets that are available within the product. So in our case, we are going to retrieve the daily data. And if we look at the form page, we can also take a look at the different variables that are available. And in our case, we're going to use the water velocity variables, so both eastward and northward. And here the seawater temperature. You can see here that the interest of a reanalysis is that it is available on a very long period. In our case, we have more than 30 years of data. Of course, to keep files of manageable size, we are only going to retrieve a few months of data. And finally, if you want to dive deeper into how the product is built, how it is validated, you can open here the links to the product user manual and the quality information document. So feel free to explore this if you want to. Then the next section is about how to actually retrieve this product within our notebook. So in this case, we're going to use the Copernicus Marine Toolbox, which is a library that can be used to download Copernicus data from the catalog. And it is also pre-installed in the Python 3 kernel if you're using the Jupyter Hub designed for the Copernicus Marine service. So the library is called Copernicus Marine. So same thing as the other libraries, we need to import it first. Then the first thing we need to do is to enter our credentials using this library. And to do that, we just call the login function, which will ask us for our credential. So just enter your username and password. And what this function will do is that it will create a local file that will contain your credentials, and that way, when you request for data from this notebook, you will not have to enter your credentials every time. So it's very practical. So in my case, the file already exists, so I don't have to create it again. But because it's already there. And so once this file is created, we are ready to actually download the data, in our case, the currents and temperature dataset. Okay, so here we're just going to build our data request. What we need to do first is to define the start date and end date of the temporal coverage that we want to retrieve, also the depth coverage that we want to retrieve. As I've mentioned, we have 50 depth levels available. Here we define this, so from 0 to 0.5 meters to retrieve only the surface layer. We are simply going to work with surface variables. And finally, we need to define the area of interest, because our dataset covers the entire Earth. And here we're going to look at the Central Pacific here, which is of course a notorious high seas area, where the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty applies, of course. So those are our key parameters. I'm just going to do a quick visualization here of our area of interest, of where it is exactly. So this is what we do here. You can see that we use here our basic geo feature that we had defined at the beginning of the notebook, and we just plot a square or rectangle here around the area that we are studying. So you can see it's at the center of the Northern Pacific here. Alright, so now we know where we are retrieving data, so now we are ready to download the dataset. So you can see here that we have entered the key variables that we had defined in the cell above here. And finally, we just need to put in the variable names that we had seen here. You can see here the variable names. So we choose the two components of the currents and temperature. And finally, in the daily dataset here, we can see the identifier of the dataset. This is here. We can copy it and paste it here to identify the dataset that we want to download. So now we can execute this cell and see if our product is indeed downloaded. Take some time here. We only take a few seconds. And apparently the download was a success, and we can see that we have a data directory that has appeared with a product inside. So it has a very long file name because it contains all the constraints of our requests. So we can see the start dates, the latitude and longitude delimitations. To make things simpler, you can see that we have stored here our subset request into a variable called dataset file. And this will enable us to open the dataset without having to copy and paste the long file name here in our notebook. You will see it used later on. So now we are ready to open the dataset and explore its content. So in the first section, to explore the data a little bit, we're going to explore ocean variability and mesoscale dynamics to identify the circulation patterns in our area of interest, which is essential to to predict the potential impacts of human activities on a broad scale. So here you can see that this is the cell where we open the dataset for the first time. So you can see here from the dataset file that I have stored here, we can convert it to a dictionary. I'm just going to decompose this step so you can understand what I mean. So you can see it contains our request, but also the file path of the final product, and this is what we want to retrieve here. So you can see that when I print it, it appears here, which corresponds exactly to our product here in the data directory. And if we enter it, of course, in the open dataset function of X-array, the dataset is opened immediately. And this is our result here when we open a dataset in the notebook. You can see that we have 4 dimensions in a dataset. So we have a time dimension, of course. We can check that it goes from the 1st of January 2024 to here the 1st of June. So this is what we had requested. You can see that we have also our latitude and longitude variables and a depth variable that has only one layer, which is a little bit above 0.5 meters. And we have our 3 variables here. So it's always useful to click on this icon that has the shape of a page here, because it displays the metadata of the variable. So here, for example, we can have the additional information that the temperature here is in degrees Celsius, which is a key information because in some datasets temperature is in Kelvin, for instance. So you may need to perform conversions, but not in our case. Here the velocity is in meters per second. So now we know what we are working with. Now we are going just to do a very quick pre-processing step because, as I've mentioned, we have here this depth dimension with only one layer. Keeping it that way may produce errors in later calculations, because having this extra dimension may just may just bother us when trying to draw maps, etc. So we can use the squeeze function that just remove those single index dimensions. And we can see that after I execute it, the depth dimension disappeared. We have here this artifact remaining, but it will not affect here the other dimensions of our dataset. And this will, and in the end, the goal of this operation is to ensure a smooth workflow during the training. Then another thing we can do is to compute the total velocity of the water by combining the two components, the vertical and the horizontal, through a simple vector norm calculation. And this is what we do here. And you can see that now in our dataset we have a new variable that is called total speed. And we can use this to draw a map of the total velocity across the entire study area. So to do that, we're just going to have a 2D map. We need to find a way to remove this time dimension. In our case, we're just going to compute the average over the entire period. This is what we do here, using the mean function of X-array across a time dimension. As a result, we only have a 2D dataset because the time dimension will be is averaged. And finally, we draw the maps with the basic geo feature, and we color it using the pcolorMesh function, which will be based on the longitude and latitude data and colored using the total speed variable from our dataset. And here with this cell, we draw the color bar of the function and add a title and show the graph, the final map. And so this is our oceanic roadmap. We can see that we have some steady path here of strong currents. Yes, this is a nice visualization. You can see that we have generally weaker currents in the north here than in the south. So this gives us the first baseline of the oceanic patterns in this area. Then we can also visualize the variability of the currents. This is the average of the total currents, but if we do the same operation but using the standard deviation instead of the average here, we can see that it is all very similar to what we did before. We can plot the same map, and we can identify here some more turbulent areas here, which are quite correlated to the locations of the strong currents area. So those areas seem to be more agitated than the others. Another thing we can examine to explore our dataset and have a general idea of the environmental baseline in this area is to use the temperature variable to calculate frontal dynamics. So here we are moving beyond simple currents and calculating the spatial gradients of the sea surface temperature. So those gradients reveal oceanic fronts that are very sharp boundaries between water masses. And usually those fronts are correlated with biological hubs with a lot of biological activities, because those show the areas where for example, the nutrients and then of course marine life aggregate, and those zones will be of course essentials in the frame of the BBNJ framework. So here we just define a function to calculate the spatial gradients of the temperatures. So what it will do is that it will create a copy of our dataset and add this gradient variable based on the latitude and longitude, of course, because we are computing the spatial gradients in both directions. So if we do this, I can just quickly display the data. We can see that now we have a grad variable for gradient, also based on the latitude and longitudes. And of course, I haven't mentioned it, but this gradient was calculated on the average temperatures over the entire period. This is why you don't have our time variable. So let's plot those frontal dynamics and see what we have. So we do have the proof that the ocean is not a uniform body of water. We have this sort of web of thermothrons, which has the shape of, let's say, filaments here, with strong gradients in yellow and weaker ones in reddish colors. And so what it implies is that any disturbance in those high temperature patches here will be significantly more damaging than in those blue or black holes here, because human activities in those corridors will directly impact biodiversity. So the next section we are going to evaluate how any disturbance from human activities can propagate in this area by performing a particle trajectory simulation. So what we're going to do is that we're going to release particle at a single departure point. Here we have chosen a point starting coordinates located at 165 degrees west and 28 degrees north. So if we look on the map, it's located here at this point exactly. So we've chosen this point because it's of course in the high seas. It's far from any coastal influence that we may be remaining here, and it's right at the middle of a lot of thermal fronts here. So we may have interesting trajectories starting from this coordinate. So here we set up the key parameters for our simulation, the initial parameters. So here are our starting coordinates. We will be releasing 200 particles, and we'll spread them a little bit randomly around the starting point with an amplitude of 0.001 degrees in geodesic coordinates. So here is a function to generate the particles at this location. So you can see that in input it takes the initial coordinates, the number of particles, and the spread in degrees around the coordinates. So it adds some randomness in the initial particle positions. And we're going to call that function, and see exactly how our particles were released. So this is what we do here. Here we're drawing two maps, one to show the initial point on the map, and one to zoom on it and see how the different particles are actually distributed. So you can see that those are just both scatter plots. So here, as I told you, this is the point of impact, and if we zoom on it, here are the 200 particles randomly spread around the first coordinate. So in the next section we will see how the trajectories behave in this current field. So this is the goal of this section. So to do this, we have developed a very simple propagation model. It just works by, so as I've mentioned, we are treating pollutants or any potential ecological markers as a particle, and we're going to calculate their journey through the entire time period covered by our dataset. So here is a simple summary of the main steps taken by the model. So first, it reads the Copernicus currents data that we have downloaded at the beginning of the training. And it reads it at each particle's position. Then for each particle it calculates the speed and direction with which to push the particles, And optionally, it also simulates some stochastic diffusion to simulate turbulence, because models don't necessarily capture small-scale phenomenon within in the water. So this is what this randomness is for. So you can see that we have decomposed it in several functions. So first we have here the model reading function that calculates the velocity at each particle position. Then the velocity is applied to the particle to update the trajectory, to display the particle during a certain time step. So here you can see that we do a conversion from degrees to actual meters, because the velocities are in meters per second, so we have to do this conversion from the coordinates. Here is the optional randomness function that just adds, just gives a little kick to the particle, and this is driven by the k variable, by this variable called k here. We're going to detail that a little bit more later. And this is the main function that does the entire simulation and that calls the other sub-functions here within itself. So you can see here that we retrieve the longitude and latitudes of the particles at the initial time step, and then we read the velocities, we apply the advection, and if we want to have the diffusion, we apply the randomness, or we don't. And finally, we update the trajectories for each time step that we have in our dataset. And then the function returns the trajectories entirely simulated. So let's try that first without any added randomness. So first we generate the particle for the initial time step, and then we call the simulation function. Using here, you can see this is our current dataset that we had downloaded in the beginning. So it goes quite quickly, and then we can visualize the trajectory of the 200 particles and see how it behaves. So here you can see that we have drawn in the background the thermal fronts that we have drawn before. So those are the this is temperature gradients in gray. The yellow cross here is the initial starting point, as we remember. And here are our trajectories drawn as, we call that spaghetti plot. And we can see here that we have some particles that, a lot of them follow this path here. And then we have here this separation between the trajectories. And we also have some of them that go this way. We can see that it follows quite nicely the eddy here drawn by the thermal fronts. So we can really see that these thermal fronts here act as corridors for the displacement of the particles. And of course, as we could expect, the trajectories are not spread out in a perfect circle. We can see that they are channeled by the thermal fronts here. So those trajectories look actually quite clean, but let's now add some stochastic diffusion. So this is what I've mentioned before. The goal is to add a little bit of randomness to simulate the smaller scale phenomenon that are not necessarily captured in the data model. So as I've mentioned, this diffusion model is driven by a variable called k, which is a diffusivity coefficient. So it is used actually to calculate the standard deviation with which to give a little kick to the particles at each time step. So it will simulate chaos of the ocean, and tweaking this k variable acts as a volume knob for the randomness intensity of the simulation. So here we are set a default value for k at 10, and let's just see how the model behaves with this added randomness. And yes, we can already see that the behavior is entirely different. Our spaghetti plots here of the trajectory is a lot more chaotic, as you can see in this view, and we have some particles that travel significantly further from the departure point. So yes, this means that we have a broader footprint for the potential impact scenario of, let's say, pollutant release in this area, for instance. So this is essential when performing an environmental impact assessment in the frame of the BBNJ treaty, because yes, added randomness may classify broader areas as potentially affected by human activities. And finally, so we have those spaghetti plots, and we can do something more sophisticated, which is risk mapping based on probabilities. The goal here is to identify in this area which parts are the most likely to be affected by, let's say, a pollutant or any other ecological marker, and to draw that as a probabilistic heat map to assess the risk depending on the area. So to do that, we are going to divide the study area into a grid, and we are going to count for each grid pixel how often we have a particle passing through. And this will give us the zone of influence of let's say here, the pollutant release. So all we have to do here is to take, so this is the function that draws the probabilistic map. So you can see that the steps are described here. So first we prepare the data, we prepare the grid, we draw the background, so it's still the SST gradient, we remember that. Here we draw the heat map as a 2D histogram. And finally, we just plot the initial point as a cross, just like we did in the previous plots. And so you can see that in input, it just takes the trajectories that were calculated with the simulations, and it also takes the SST gradient to draw the background map. And now, if you plot it, we can see here the entire area of influence of our pollutant release. So this is our initial point in the blue cross, and you can see, of course, that when we are close to the point here, where the risk of being affected is very strong, because we have a lot of passage of particles. Here you can see that the core map is colored according to the number of passage from particles. And we tend to have, of course, a smaller influence in the broader areas. We can see that over the 6 months of data that we have, particles tend to go more to the northeast rather than the southwest, for instance. Here, this is quite obvious. And so I've mentioned here that we had done this study on a 6-month period. The next section is dedicated to seasonal dynamics. So the idea here is to compute the same simulation, but only during winter and only during spring. So during the first 3 months of our dataset, and then the next 3 other months. No, sorry, this is actually only during January and during April. So we have the middle of winter and middle of spring. So you can see here that we just subset our dataset using the self function, and we use a time slice to retrieve only 1 month from the dataset. So here January and here April. So you can just take a quick look for the winter, for instance, and you can see here that we have the same spatial dimensions, but here only 30 time coordinates, and of course from the 1st to the 30th of January. And then here we do the same thing as at the beginning of the notebook. As in the beginning of the notebook, we calculate the average data sets and the gradients, the temperature gradients that will be used to draw the background maps. Here we simulate the trajectories. We use the same initial particles. And then we can draw the density map, the probability map for the winter. So first we can see that we have a much smaller area of influence because of course we've used only 1 month of data, so we had less time steps to see the propagation over the entire area. But we see that in winter we have a strong dynamic towards the southeast. And if we do the same for the spring, we can see that on the contrary, the probability plum here is in the opposite direction. It actually goes from towards the northwest, which is the opposite of the winter dynamics. And this proves that, well, when doing an environmental impact assessment, the operational timing is essential. So seasonality and the date of the activities has to be taken into account when planning projects under the BBNJ treaty. So we are reaching the end of this notebook. Here are some exercises if you would like to go further. So you can of course rerun the entire simulation using different points of origin, and you can also experiment with the randomness. So I've introduced you the diffusion coefficient K. So you can try to play with it to see if it changes the trajectories here. So you can push it to the max and see how it influences the plots. And you see that in my case, when we push it like this, we have extremely chaotic trajectories. And for more intermediate users, if you're already familiar with Python, if you can already code quite well, yes, you can try to extend the simulations by downloading more data. And also, one thing that could be very interesting is to try to perform the simulation on other depth levels. So remember, here we only studied surface variables, but as mentioned at the beginning, our product provides 50 depth levels available. So if I remember correctly, I think that it was written somewhere, the range was written somewhere here. Yes, it goes from approximately 0.5 meters to 5,000 meters, so could be interesting to try other depth level and see if the currents behave in a similar way or not. Probably not. So feel free to do these exercises to, if you would like to, if you want to go further in this subject. And now it's time to end this notebook. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.